Hi everyone, this is lesson 2 from Gospel Symbolism. Today we're going to be talking about the numbers and shapes of God's alphabet. So just a reminder, kind of an overview from last time. Our alphabet, we can combine those different letters into infinite possibilities with different meanings and emotions behind them. Likewise, with God's alphabet, he uses numbers and shapes, lights and colors, etc. to combine and give us new information, emotions, to convey his mysteries and wisdom to us. Today we are going to be going through the numbers and shapes. Today we are going to be going through the numbers and shapes, and a lot of it I'm going to be referencing ldsymbols.com, and we're going to be going through that website in class because of copyright restrictions and obviously things. I'm not going to be publishing that in this video, but I highly recommend this video. I'll put a link in the description as well. Go and watch his video about the symbols, and then go to his website. I'll be giving the links to each part of that website as well, and go and study those things. If you have any other questions, come talk to me personally, and I'll go through some of the fun symbolisms of these pages of his website as well. All right, so one disclaimer, we're going to be talking a lot about numbers today. We don't want to misapply our principles of algebra onto symbols. So, like when we put a minus sign in front of a 1, it doesn't make it negative in symbolism. You need to divide and different things in order to do that. Likewise, if we flip a symbol upside down, it doesn't change it. It makes it an entirely new symbol. So just keep that in mind as we're going through things. So we have the number 1. It represents unity, it represents a compass, complete cycle, cup, immortality, heavens, and spirit. The compass that I'm talking about is like one of those geometry compasses where you have a point and then a pencil in order to help draw a circle. That's what we use throughout all of symbolism. We're not talking about a compass that points north, south, east, and west. We're talking about a compass that transcribes truth into one great whole. So go to that website there, and you'll see lots of different images and examples of the number 1 and explanations of why it means each one of those things. But as we are one in purpose, we are unified. We're all connected in one circle. There's no beginning points or end points. It's just one great whole. It represents heaven as a unified body. Complete cycle, the cup, for an obvious shape there, the spirit. Later we'll talk about how 4 is of the body, and so a circle and a square are going to be the separate parts of our being. Next is the number 2. This is representative of covenants, law, marriage, opposition, portals, and witnesses. So this is the Vesica Pisces shape, but that's not the only shape that represents a number 2. So the Vesica Pisces literally means the bladder of a fish in Latin. So it's reflecting a resemblance of the conjoined dual air bladders, the swim bladders found in most fish. And it's when you take 2 circles and overlap them, that's how you make the shape, the intersecting part of the 2 circles, kind of like a Venn diagram representation there. So, that represents our eyes. It's in the shape of our eyes, the shape of our mouth. And those are portals for vision, portals for sound. Covenants, this is an important part. I think 2 is probably one of my favorite symbolic numbers because of the covenants and how that represents it. So we do have 2 endpoints, and as we start at 1, we split and go out, and we come back. And that resembles a chiastic structure, the leaving and coming back. But in Hebrew, in the Jewish customs, in order to make a covenant, the phrase literally was to cut a covenant. So anytime things were cut or rent, sometimes you would rend your clothes as a token of the covenant. There's always blood associated with covenant making. So we cut a covenant, meaning separating it in two, in order to be joined later on. So 2 is all about the cutting of covenants, the separating and the coming back together. That's why marriage covenant, we're taking two people and cutting them from their original families and joining them together in a new and an everlasting union. The opposition in all things, we have two different laws in Eden that are equal and opposite, and then they come together in order to bring about mankind. The law of witnesses, in the mouths of two witnesses, all doctrine and truth shall be established. All right, go to that website. It's great on the number 2. It explains things a lot better than I can. All right, number 3. So we have obvious references to the Trinity, the Godhead, God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We have beginning, middle, end. We have past, present, future. The presidency, our modern presidencies are in 3s for a reason. And then structure. So in geometry class, when we're building bridges or designing the bridge making process, we learn that when we incorporate triangles into it, it starts building and beefing up that structure so that things don't fall. That's very important in a gospel setting as well. The structure that 3 brings to an organization or a body of people. So in a sense, it can also represent unity, but that beefing up of the structure. Likewise, as found in the book that I recommend for this class, the Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe, it talks about 3 as being a negative as well. And it can, all fractures, if you ever looked at a windshield that got cracked or a cement pad that has cracks and fissures in it, they always occur in 3s. Very rarely there might be a 4 crack, but division and cracking and things like that can happen in 3s. And so that's an important part of, there's a positive and a negative connotation to some of the numbers. Moving on to 4, we have the 4 that represents the body. It represents the body because it represents mortality, more like it represents this earth. Our earth is not flat like a map. It's round, but it does have the 4 corners of the earth that are often represented. It has the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. We have anything that is mortal, like our bodies, are represented by 4. We have 4 seasons. There's bread. The shape of a loaf of bread can be simplified down into a 4 if you're looking at the loaf from one end or the other. And so very much the sacrament, the 4 is the bread and 1 is the cup of water, the circle and the square, where heaven and earth meet there. All right, moving on to 5. Here we're starting to get into grams and gongs. So the difference between a pentagon and a pentagram, as shown here, the one is 5 lines and the other is 5 points that represent its outermost limits there. And so they often represent the same thing if it's a gram or a gong. But so 5 is representative of God's grace. It represents Christ and man's fallen state, and it represents the gate between heaven and earth. So the circle and the square that I just talked about, where earth and heaven meet, the earth being the 4, the heaven being the 1, that's very representative of holy places. And so with the fallen state of Christ, his mortal body is often represented with a 5, and his resurrected body is represented with an 8. And so the 5 and 8, when you take a 5 and make it holy with a 3, then you represent an elevated state, which is in the eights. We have 5 sacrifices in the Levitical law: the heifer, the goat, ram, dove, and pigeon. There's the parable of the 10 virgins, where there's 5 that are prepared and 5 that aren't. With David, he picks 5 stones in order to slay Goliath, but God only needed the one. And so we have that 5 versus 1 principle as well coming into that story. With 6, it's an opposition to God, something that is imperfect, it falls short, and also the armor of God. So, I mean, those are wildly different here, but the opposition to God is something that comes about because of the imperfectness of mortal beings. 7, our next number, very much represents complete and holy and everything there. So 6 falls just short of holy or complete. And so it very much so represents an opposition to God, something that falls short of his glory. We have, with the armor of God, we have the girdle, the breastplate, sandals, shield, helmet, and sword. When we take the hours of a day, we have 4 of them, 4 sets of 6 to equal our 24 hours. And so it's used in mortal or imperfect measurements, how we reckon our days and times. An interesting thing to note with the Star of David, it's represented by 2 overlapping triangles, which are the basic structures or building blocks of life. And the upward triangle represents the male part. The female is represented by the upside down triangle. And so when you combine the male and the female, the phallus and the womb for a simplified version of it, then you represent the marriage covenant, the mortal portal to bring children into mortality, kind of thing. And it's interesting that's the Star of David, and that's exactly what David lost his salvation by. He will eventually get it in the eternities, but through that mortal, the incomplete, imperfect part of him, he fell just short of salvation in this life. All right, moving on. So I'm diving too far into some of the things that we'll cover in future classes as well. So the 7 is the most common of all numbers in symbolism. It represents a complete cycle. It represents light, the mysteries of God, purity, victory, perfection, revelation, covenant making, and the perfect or immortal measurements of God. You know, I tried to make a perfect 7-sided star there, or a 7-pointed star there, and it's not easy, but that is in no way reflecting of how perfect the number 7 is. It's used everywhere. There's 7 days of creation. There's 7-year cycles. There's so many things in 7s, and I highly encourage you read that website and find the number 7 as you're reading in your scriptures. All right, 8 is the number for Christ as a resurrected or mediator. It represents rebirth and renewal, sacred space, transition from heaven to earth to heaven, and also a superabundance. So the 8 octagon is represented by 2 overlapping squares, and you find that symbol, which is called the symbol of Melchizedek, all over the San Diego temple, the Idaho Falls temple. There's many temples that represent that rebirth and renewal. All right, 10 is part of a tithe, but it represents something that's complete, a complete subset. So the 10 Commandments were altogether whole, but they're not the whole of God's laws. They're just a complete subset of it. Much like our tithing is not our whole income, but it is a complete subset which we consecrate and back to the Lord. 12 is very indicative of the priesthood, the power and the right to govern. With the 12 tribes of Israel, we have the breastplate that the priests would wear, and each stone represents one of the tribes. There's a lot more to that, and we'll discuss it more in future classes as well. Jumping ahead to 40, all of the numbers in between can represent things as well, but I'm just going through some of the main basic structures that we want to memorize. 40 represents a lengthy period of time, a period of trial, testing, probation, or mourning. So the Israelites wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, does it mean that they actually traveled for 40 years to the day? Not necessarily. They could very well have, but it just represents a lengthy period of time. Christ's 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. I mean, there's lots of things that are represented by 40. And we'll be getting into some of those 40-year spans and 400-year spans a little bit later. 1,000. So 1,000 is a way to just magnify or embellish whatever you're talking about. Represents power, strength, magnitude, greatness, vastness, incalculable, and a multitude. So 10,000s is an ancient way of saying great numbers. 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands might signify what we would call infinite in our modern vernacular. So applying to holy math, we have another class set up just for gematria and holy math, but we take this 144,000. We can break it up into 12 times 1,000. If 12 represents the priesthood, multiplying something against itself signifies an even greater priesthood power. So if that were to represent our current orders of the priesthood, Levitical, Melchizedek, and then times it by 1,000, meaning multitudes, 144,000 really means multitudes of those with greater overwhelming priesthood power than that of Aaronic or Melchizedek orders. So President Nelson has asked us to seek the face of the Lord and do whatever is necessary to gain the greater priesthood power. He's asking us to be part of the 144,000 who will be translated in order to perform the greater missions during the days of tribulation. So this 144,000 is so significant in this day. I mean, from the year 2017 through 2024, this is when the 144,000 are going to be translated and get the power of those higher priesthood blessings. Anyway, there's a lot more on that, but this is the symbolism class. We'll move on. All right, so gematria, reckoning by numbers. This is very significant, but also very convoluted over the decades and centuries that we've been reckoning by numbers. It's going to vary from language to language because it's all based upon the alphabet. Now, to explain the principle of it, I've done our English alphabet here. So A through Z. How it works is that you take the number system 1 through 9, but you don't continue on 10, 11, 12 kind of thing. Once you hit 9, you've hit your base, and you're going to start adding zeros in each column. So if you look at A, J, and S, it goes from 1 to 10 to 100. So 1 through 9, 10 through 90, 100 through, it would be 900 if we had more letters in our alphabet, and so forth. So each language's alphabet is going to be different, and obviously different words are going to have different meanings associated with them. So we will get into that. We have a whole class set up just for gematria, and we're going to be diving into Hebrew versus English and so forth. But let's take a look and get some practice with some of these right now. So let's spell out the word Adam. Now take A, which is 1, D, which is 4, A, which is 1, and M, which is 40, and add those all together. It equals 46. Now take it and go with Eve. I'll give you a couple minutes. Write that down. Calculate it out. What is Eve's number? Now we have Eve represented by 410. So that's wildly different than Adam's 46, even though she has less numbers because she has a wider contrast of letters. they're going to equal more. So for example, my name Cameron, 3 plus 1 plus 40 plus 5 plus 90 plus 60 plus 50. We have 249 is my number. Try spelling out your name. Try coming up with Jehovah or other biblical names, and see if there's any significance in those numbers, and kind of pull out what might be some of the symbolisms as you break your number down into some of its basic parts. Now, just a quick hint forward to a different class. When we take the gematria in Hebrew, and we take Adam and we take Eve and their numbers, when you take Adam's number minus Eve's number, it represents the number given to Yahweh or Jehovah. And so it signifies greater principles when we start using this reckoning by numbers and holy mathematics in order to symbolize that Adam without Jehovah would never have an Eve, and that marriage was put together by deity, by God. It represents kind of the triangle principle of marriage. I mean, we are married, husband and wife, yet without Jehovah, we don't have a complete structure or a triangle that can last throughout the eternities. Anyway, we're going to be really diving into that one. Look forward to that class on gematria. So let's dive into spans and cycles of certain numbers in our current years as we know them. So we have 7 periods of creation. We have sabbatical years in Hebrew. You know, our sabbatical years nowadays are just when people earn them or request them off and to take time to learn and progress. But sabbatical years in the Jewish culture are called Shemitah, and debts are to be forgiven, agricultural lands to lie fallow, private land holdings to become open to the commons, and staples such as food storage and perennial harvests are to be freely redistributed and accessible to all. So, I mean, it's a year of cleansing. It's a year of kind of tithing, if it were. It's not represented by a 10, but a 7, where everything's kind of given back to the Lord. It's kind of the day of rest as the day of creations play out. He rested on the 7th day. We should rest on the 7th year. And it's interesting here for Jubilees. The next Jewish sabbatical year, or Shemitah, starts on September 7th, 2021. I find that very significant. So moving on to Jubilees, we've kind of heard of those, maybe reference here and there, but here's what they are. So we take 7 times 7, because God loves to use math and multiply in his symbolism. So when we take 7 times 7, that's obviously 49, and we know that Jubilee years are on 50-year cycles. So it takes, when we have every 7 years of Shemitah, it's followed by a Jubilee year. So it's almost like an additional year of tithing on top of everything. And that's when prisoners are freed, when debts are forgiven. I mean, everything just resets on a Jubilee year because of our gratefulness that the Lord has allowed us another generation to pass. The last Jubilee started on September 30th, 2017, which is also highly significant. It falls in line with just right after the great solar eclipse in August. So the 7 years of tribulation, they start in 2017 and go through 2024. Though they start and end with a total solar eclipse, and it's very interesting to study the 7 years of that tribulation, because I mean, tribulation is going to be a negative connotation, but we come closer to the Lord through those 7 years as well. The wicked get wickeder, the righteous get more righteous. All right, moving on to 400-year cycles. So My first introduction to this was through a book by Don Bradley called The Lost 116 Pages. And he goes through the two significant ones in the Book of Mormon, where from the year 600 BC, when Lehi leaves Jerusalem and establishes his righteous branch, to the year 200, the Nephite civilization kind of collapses, and they have to merge with the group from Zarahemla. Likewise, when Christ visits the Americas, we just kind of represent it year zero there, to 400 years after Christ comes and visits them, we have complete Nephite destruction. So, in the 400-year cycles, we have 200 years of righteousness. And then right almost to the day, or at least to the year 201, we have Satan and wickedness entering into the camp there, kind of thing. And then year 320, there's always a main event that happens. And then by year 400, there's a complete collapse. So if you take this and apply it to other things as well, we found many different 400-year cycles that apply throughout all of the history of the earth. But here's some significant ones. Solomon's temple dedication in 940 BC. And then in 540 BC, we have a return to Zion from Persia. So it's not always just negative. A lot of the 400-year spans are the 200 years of righteousness, then 200 years of wickedness, kind of a thing. So we have Solomon's temple being dedicated, and then at the 200-year mark, then wickedness enters in and they're taken captive, but then they return. So the year 400 is not always a complete collapse, but sometimes it's the restoration of the covenant. So, interesting, here on the American continent, the year 1620, the Pilgrims land. So year 200 years after that, 1820, that's interesting. And here we are in 2020, year 400. Interesting. All right, so for our homework assignment, let's do whatever we can, create flashcards, whatever works best for you, and memorize the numbers 1 through 10, the number 12, number 40, and number 1000, and their respective shapes. So memorize what shapes kind of go with what numbers, how to create those shapes, and then just kind of the basics of how they occur. Like, for example, the number 40 on the back of your flashcard, the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Some different examples of when they occur in scriptures.